Alright, so today we're talking about The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a book that I've read 3 times now, and I'm looking forward to digging in to my views on the book and how those views have changed as I've reread it. Part 1, Summary. The Secret History is a confession told by Richard Papin, who admits to us right at the start that he has murdered one of his classmates during his university days. Part of The Secret History builds up to this murder. Richard arrives at university and wants to study classics, but he learns that the only classics professor, Julian, is an elitist who is very selective about his students. Fortunately, Richard is able to join the small set of students: Bunny, Henry, Francis, Charles and Camilla. With the exception of Bunny, who is friendly to Richard right from the start, Richard's classmates are cold and aloof, but also very privileged and interesting. What Richard doesn't know is that they have secretly been trying to recreate ancient Dionysian rites, Dionysus being the ancient god of wine and frenzy. Unfortunately for them, the students do not understand the dangers of what they are doing, and their efforts to reach the gods take them down a path of murder, which Richard, enamoured by the beauty of the ancients and his friends' attempts to reach it, becomes complicit in. Part 2. Dark Academia, Elitism and Knowledge. The Secret History is a novel that appears on one level to romanticise the pursuit of knowledge and university life, and Richard finds himself very much sucked into this elitist world that he finds himself in. And one of the things you'll find if you read the book, or if you read the book, is that you will also be sucked in along with Richard. You want to be part of Julian's elite set of classics students because you feel special and you feel like you're getting in touch with some forbidden knowledge that none of the normie students have access to. And this is definitely an attitude that Richard takes pretty much throughout the novel. He constantly compares mainstream university life to the life of his friends. And he's also pretty damning when it comes to the mainstream academics as well. The funniest example of this is the character of Dr. Rowland, who Richard works for a while. And Richard portrays Dr. Rowland as if he's borderline got dementia. He's always forgetting things, he's completely useless and just completely absent. As is the university management, it's pretty incompetent as well. In contrast to this, Julian is portrayed as an enigmatic professor who's deeply inspiring, captures his students' attention and teaches them things that really enrich them. And most of the students, especially Henry, is treated in a very idealized way, as if he's literally touching the gods because of the knowledge he has, whereas the normie students get treated as if they're just kind of dumb, not very interesting, drug addicts and drunkards for the most part. Richard's views change on this as the novel progresses, but one thing that's interesting is that, although on the surface Tartt seems to be romanticising this elitist intellectual life, if we actually look at the two groups, they're not really that different. Julian is quite different from the mainstream academics, but how much can we really trust what Richard says of mainstream academia when he doesn't really have that much engagement with it, and he clearly has a preference himself? Richard's classmates and Richard himself are constantly getting drunk, constantly taking drugs, and generally being quite reckless, and they actually spend comparatively little time talking about Greeks and the classics. Despite the fact that Richard goes on about how amazing all of this stuff is, he seems more interested in the debauchery of it all. So really there becomes a question of how different is he really from the mainstream students? And when you progress through the book, I think even he starts to question that a little bit as well, when everything starts collapsing down around him. I have read some criticisms of The Secret History on the grounds that it's fetishizing academia in a dangerous way. So we think about the dark academia sort of trend where people aestheticize academics without actually engaging in the substance of it. But I think that this interpretation really misses the point, because when you pay attention to the novel and how it turns out, it's clear that Tartt has a more ambivalent message about academia and elitism. On the one hand, you might think that she's actually quite negative about it, given what happens to the characters through the course of the novel. It's not like they actually get to come out on the other side with happy endings for the most part. I think that Tartt is ultimately ambivalent about the moral message of her book, which is as it should be. Because on the one hand, Julian remains an inspiring teacher even at the end of the book. Richard still idealizes Julian and thinks that he is great in a kind of way. And there is something to be said for the way that Julian teaches his students. And at the end of the novel, when the university comes in and takes over Richard's education, they don't do a very good job. The replacement teacher that they get for Julian is from a school and he's rubbish, and Richard does finish university, but he doesn't talk about his degree in English literature with anywhere near the level of reverence that he talks about Julian. So there does seem to be something here in Tartt's novel where she's suggesting that there is something admirable about Julian and his elitism and that whole dark academia thing. But on the other hand, it also takes the characters down some very dark places. In the pursuit of knowledge, the main characters get their fingers burned. They reach out to touch Dionysus and everything goes wrong for them. They think that Dionysus is just this fun-loving god of wine, but they forget that he's also a god that leads to frenzy, destruction and violence. As Camille Paglia says of Dionysus, the Dionysian is no picnic, and that's certainly what the characters misunderstand and what they learn in the course of the story. And in fact, this idea is reinforced by the quote from Nietzsche with which Tartt starts her novel. In this quote, Nietzsche says two things. Firstly, that a young man cannot possibly know the Greeks and Romans, and secondly, that he doesn't know whether he is suited for finding out about them. And I think that this is very much true of the characters. They can't possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. They're trying to understand an ancient culture, but because they're not in that culture, there's a kind of distancing between them and the ancients, and that means that they don't really understand what it is they're getting into. So on the one hand, it does seem like Tartt is saying something negative about Julian and his way of teaching and the pursuit of knowledge that the characters take. But on the other hand, as a reader and as someone who's reread the book, every time you can't help but get swept away in what the characters are doing in the pursuit of Dionysus. And it does seem like they do maybe even glimpse Dionysus. And so through Julian's teaching, they actually get to maybe touch a god or something like that. And it's not clear that in the mainstream university you're going to have any kind of amazing experience like that. And so there's a kind of ambiguity in the novel at its end. On the one hand, with Julian's style of teaching, you're able to touch a god, but ultimately that maybe doesn't end the way you want it to. But on the other hand, you just have a kind of mundane existence. And it's not clear that Tartt has much positive to say about mainstream university life in the book, which is why I think that her message is ultimately somewhere in the middle there. Another reason that I think the tension remains unresolved at the end is because Richard himself is ambivalent by the end of the story. As the novel progresses, he does become a little bit less elitist. He spends more time hanging out with the mainstream students and seems to enjoy it a lot more and see them more as real people rather than just as sort of dipshits and drunkards, which is nice for him to kind of have that revelation, but ultimately he does still seem somewhere caught in the middle by the time we get to the end of the story. Part 3. Unreliable narrators, manipulators, and Dionysus. One great thing about The Secret History is that every time I have read it, I have found something new that I missed in a previous read, and this thing that I've found has completely changed my attitude towards some of the characters. There are lots of small mysteries in The Secret History that you're just not going to pick up on the first time that you read it. And I think partly that's because the first time you read it, you know that Bunny is going to get killed, and so most of the time you're just paying attention to that and when it's going to happen, rather than paying attention to the little things that the characters are doing along the way. Probably the character who my attitudes have changed the most on during the course of my reading this book has been Henry, who was a character that I admired on the first read for the most part. I was a bit unsure about on the second read, and now I just think he's a pretty evil psychopath. Richard is also a character who I've become more sceptical of over time as well. A part of this is because he is clearly still very much enamoured by Henry and Julian by the end of the story. He's almost deified them to a point, and he never really seems to fully embrace any critique of them. Sometimes he does maybe speculate a little bit on whether Henry is manipulating them, but he quickly drops it, and the same with Julian. He's always supporting those two for the most part. But I think that Richard's little moments where he reflects on whether Henry is manipulating them are a clue, perhaps to the fact that Henry really is manipulating them. The biggest example of this is of course Bunny's murder, which is basically Henry's idea. Henry tries to convince the group that murdering Bunny is the only solution to their problem. Now Richard, when he's brought into this, suggests that maybe he could speak to Bunny as a kind of someone who's maybe more independent than the rest of the group. But Henry quickly denounces that idea and says that Bunny doesn't like Richard because Bunny is jealous of Richard because he's come into the group and he's sort of taken Bunny's place. And Richard accepts this and never speaks to Bunny, and so we never find out if this is actually true. Now I think it is consistent with Bunny's character that he might be a little bit jealous of Richard, but sometimes people use truth in a way to manipulate and to get what they want, and sometimes people exaggerate the truth as well to do that. Even if Bunny was jealous in that way, if Richard went to him and spoke to him about this, that might actually soften him towards Richard because he's choosing his side over Henry's. And I think that this is the reason why Henry is manipulating Richard, because Henry knows that if Richard does go over to Bunny, he might be swayed to Bunny's side, and then he has two people who might go and tell what crimes him and the rest of them committed when they were pursuing their Dionysian rituals. And so Henry's very aware that he needs to keep Richard on side, because if those two go together, everyone is in serious trouble. And so a very good way to make sure we keep Bunny and Richard separate is to overstate or to lie even and say that Bunny doesn't like Richard, and this works. And I think that Henry really is manipulating Richard here. But again, we never find out in the story because Richard never speaks to Bunny. And if you doubt this, one thing to remember is that Bunny is the first person in the group when Richard joins to offer his hand of friendship. He takes Richard out for dinner, and fair enough, he does expect Richard to pay for it without Richard knowing this, but Bunny does that to everyone, so it's not clear that he's doing that out of malice. That's just Bunny's way, immoral as it may be. And so there is something there that suggests that maybe Bunny does have at least ambivalent feelings towards Richard. Another big secret in the book relating to Henry is his relationship with Julian, and also Julian's role in the rituals and also the aftermath. There's an early scene in the book where Richard walks in on Julian and Henry who are having a conversation together, and Julian kisses Henry on the cheek, or Henry kisses Julian on the cheek. It's one way or the other. And Richard remarks on this a little bit, but then just kind of forgets about it. And the hint is that Julian has given Henry the permission to pursue these rituals. So Julian is some kind of instigator in all of the story and implicated in its consequences. Given the Greek connection, you have to wonder how much Tartt is hinting towards a perhaps sexual or at least romantic relationship between Julian and Henry here, in the way that the ancient Greeks, you would have this sort of teacher-student relationship where they would sleep together. It seems like there's at least a hint towards that, but again, we never get any concrete answers. But there is also another scene when Richard mentions how Henry's voice lights up whenever Julian is in the room or whenever he picks up the phone to him. And there is this sense that they have this very deep relationship that we never really learn all that much about. Whether that's sexual, romantic, or something else, it's definitely not the kind of thing that we would expect in a modern day teacher-student relationship, and it certainly seems to be insidious. It also invites the question of how much Julian knew about this whole operation. He clearly knew about the ritual, he must have therefore known about its consequence, that they killed someone, and he must have maybe put two and two together about Bunny's murder as well. Perhaps the only thing that bothers him in the end is that they botch the job a little bit, and so he feels implicated in it. We'll never know, because again, Tartt is really good at keeping all of these things as mysteries. And because Richard is always so forgiving towards Henry and Julian, again, it's not clear from the narrator that you're always getting the full picture there. Dionysus is not only the god of wine, he's also known as the god of illusions, and he's related to transformation. And one thing to think about when reading the book is which character best represents Dionysus, if any. Could it be Julian as the kind of instigator of the whole thing, guiding his students and pushing them towards chaos? Originally I did lean on the side of it being Julian, but on rereads, again, I think I'm leaning more towards Henry as the god of illusions, and Julian maybe being a little bit more naive, and maybe Henry is the one that knows the most. Julian is ultimately a coward who runs away from the danger when it comes, but Henry not only embraces it, but seems to thrive off of the chaos. Even his suicide is almost an act of empowerment. Henry also has a few Dionysian lines. At one point when he's talking about Bunny's murder, he mentions something along the lines of, "It's just a simple rearrangement of matter," which is a very Dionysian line. All you're doing is reassembling matter, transforming into something else when you kill someone, and therefore it's not really so bad. A terrible way to think, and this is why I do think Henry is somewhat a psychopath, because no human being would think like that. And Richard at one point also talks about Henry having this capacity for transformation, not only transforming himself in certain ways, but transforming the people around him. And as should be clear by now, Henry is a very skilled manipulator, and he manipulates a lot of the characters throughout the novel. And so for those reasons, I think he is the best candidate for Dionysus, the god of illusions. Part 4. beauty and substance. Julian and all of the students, and even Richard, appear to be one thing on the surface, but underneath they are all crumbling wrecks. Although they appear wealthy, Charles, Camilla and Bunny are actually not that wealthy as it turns out. Charles and Camilla live with their grandmother and their money is basically running out, and Bunny's family does have money, but they don't give him any money, and also they seem to be losing their money. Only Francis and Henry seem to be genuinely wealthy. But of course they're all still privileged despite this. We've already talked about Julian, who also has this very charming exterior, but underneath there is something more selfish, more cruel and cowardly even. And Richard also falls into this. When he becomes a part of the group, because he's surrounded by elite students, he lies about his education and his background and his knowledge of Greek, and this is something that some of the characters pick up on and even bully him for as the story progresses. For Richard, this has disastrous results. During the holidays, he decides to stay at the university rather than go home because he has a terrible relationship with his parents, but he doesn't want to tell his friends where he's staying because he's staying in a hovel, because that's all he can afford. And this hovel has a hole in the roof, and it's in Vermont, it's very cold, and he gets seriously sick. And he refuses to tell anyone what's going on because he's told this huge web of lies, and he doesn't want to admit to his friends that he's not the wealthy person that he implied. There's also a lot of repression in most of the characters here. Sexuality is something that isn't a main focus of the novel, but it's something that constantly creeps up, especially homosexuality, which seems to be a very large preoccupation in Richard's mind. He has a few passes with Francis, who is openly gay, but even Francis at the end of the novel ends up marrying a woman, so he represses himself. Richard is also often wondering a lot about the sexuality of the other men, and he constantly remarks on how Camilla, who he fancies, he remarks on how much she looks like her twin brother, which is again kind of a bizarre thing if you're constantly comparing a girl to a boy. And so I'm not saying that Richard is necessarily homosexual, but there is certainly this aspect of repression in his character and in some of the other characters as well. There's also a line at one point about the Greeks and repression and how it's important in Greek culture to constantly let out aspects of repression through Dionysian rituals as a way to sort of maintain mental balance. And you can sort of read the novel maybe as a bubbling up of repressions of the characters who are all repressed in their different ways, bubbling up and going mad and having this frenzy. Julian is another character whose sexuality is kind of ambiguous. He's not married, he has this thing with Henry, who knows what that is. And so again, you're always just left with these questions about what is going on, what are these characters hiding? And at the end of the novel, there's very few characters who you really feel like you know inside and out. Probably the only two characters of the group that I would say you really get to know in that way are Francis and Charles. Charles because he basically has a breakdown and so everything comes out in the end anyway with him. And Francis because he does seem to be, of the group, the one that through the course of the novel Richard does become closest to. They have some conversations about personal things with each other. And Camilla, she always keeps herself at a distance. It's hard to say with her how far she is in with Henry and his insidiousness, or how far she's maybe just a victim as well, because she just keeps herself so cold and aloof from Richard. Part 5. A modern day Greek tragedy. A recurring motif in Greek tragedies is fate. Often we will know the fate of a character, usually because of a prophecy or something else, at the very start of the play, and then the interesting thing about the play is seeing how it's going to play out. Obviously the most famous example of this would be the Oedipus plays, when we know going in that Oedipus is prophesied to marry his mother and to kill his father. We know he's done this. The question is, how is he going to realise that he's done this? The secret history follows a familiar line, at least in the first part of the story, because we know right from the beginning that Bunny is going to die. It's not a prophecy per se, because it's being retold by Richard, but we know what's going to be happening. And so the interesting thing then becomes, how is this going to unfold, and what are its consequences going to be? Another common feature in Greek tragedy is defiance, in particular defiance to the gods, although sometimes defiance to political authority, but mainly the gods, and these acts of hubris towards the gods usually get punished. Oedipus thinks he can outsmart fate and thinks he has, and look what happens to him. Pentheus in the Bacchae, which is the play of Dionysus, he refuses to acknowledge Dionysus, and Dionysus makes him pay, and his mother pay, for this. And in the secret history we have a similar kind of thing, We have these arrogant students trying to tap into these ancient rituals that they don't really understand, and they all come up croppers for it. Even Henry, who of them seems the most in touch with Greek culture, does come across as ignorant, and Tartt has a few little moments where she makes this clear. The funniest example of this is when he is trying to come up with ways to kill Bunny and he thinks of poisoning him, and he consults these ancient books about poisoning. And Richard, who was previously a medical student before he dropped out, sees him doing this and is completely shocked and says, you know, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. You can't be consulting ancient stuff on things like this. And Henry is just so in love with the ancients that he basically responds with, nope, they are the best authorities on this. I'm going to keep reading these books, thank you very much. And there is a kind of stupidity in Henry there. He's so in love with ancient culture. He's sort of got this snobbery about it where anything that came later is just completely worthless and inferior. Now you might think that when it comes to something like art, because art is something that maybe can have phases of progression and regression and whatever. But when it comes to something like scientific knowledge and advancements, it's less obvious that you can make those kinds of judgments, at least not in the very glib way that Henry does. Henry is just sucked into Julian's worldview. Julian is another example of this. He forces his students not only to study exclusively with him, but exclusively the classics. I think he lets Richard take one modern language, but ultimately it's all about the classics, it's all about the Greeks, and that's it. And this is an incredibly narrow and ignorant way of teaching. Yes, there's something to be said for having a deep knowledge and understanding of something, but when you have an overly narrow knowledge of something and you don't understand anything outside of that, that can actually limit your ability to understand the thing that you're looking at, because you just have less perspective that you can take on things. In fact, in aesthetics and criticism, it's typically seen that one of the ideal characteristics of a critic is having a very broad knowledge of the arts across the board. Because the more knowledge you have of the arts across the board, the more you're not going to be sucked in to bias, the more you're going to be open-minded when it comes to engaging with different things. And these are all qualities that Henry and Julian lack. And so when it comes to the connection to the Greek tragedy, I think that that is ultimately what their fatal flaw is. It's this hubris about knowledge, thinking that they can just play around with the gods and realizing, like every Greek hero does that does things like this, that they can't and that the gods are going to punish them. Part 6. Poor Bunny. So I've talked a lot about Henry and Julian and how I initially liked them more but have come to like them less on rereads. Now I want to talk about Bunny, who is a character who I have actually come to like a lot more on rereads. And I think in part this is because of my growing dislike of Henry, because the more I realise that Henry is manipulative, the more I start to sympathise with Bunny, who is ultimately the major victim of Henry's manipulations. But that Tartt is able to make you want Bunny to die and you want Henry and everyone else to succeed just shows what a great storyteller she is. And she does this with a couple of techniques. She makes Bunny very unlikable even before the major drama happens. When he takes Richard out for lunch, he's homophobic towards a waiter, he makes Richard pay for, or expects Richard to pay for his dinner without asking him, and so you get, you're already kind of not really liking this character, and then he just gets worse as it goes. Also what she does is she makes sure that Richard never really talks to Bunny about what happened with the rituals, and so we never get Bunny's side of the story. And so by silencing him in that way, and then silencing him permanently by killing him, it's very hard to actually root for Bunny or feel sympathy for him, but it's much easier to root for Henry and Richard because their perspectives are the perspectives that we're getting and that are being empathized with. But to think about Bunny as a character, he's actually deeply insecure. He does seem to be the least intelligent in the group. Again, I do think Richard exaggerates his stupidity in the text. He can't be that stupid or Julian wouldn't have picked him for his group. And I think that Richard is again being elitist in this by making Bunny out to be thicker than everybody else. He's sort of casting him as the black sheep of the group so that again you feel like he's a member of the outgroup, so it's okay when they kill him. The major thing though that made me sympathize with Bunny comes in the part of the novel when Bunny and Henry go on holiday together during the winter, and during this holiday, which is a complete disaster, Bunny reads Henry's diary, and in this diary finds out that Henry really doesn't like him and has said lots of disparaging things about him, calling Bunny Rabbit, among other things. Again, we never get the full details about this, and Richard never talks to Bunny about this, but one thing that we do notice is that it is after this point that things really start to turn sour, with Bunny's treatment of the group. And so you have to wonder how much Bunny's blackmailing them and being cruel to them is actually because of what was in that diary, rather than because of the crime that they committed. And to some extent, if that is the case, it's understandable. Bunny thought he was part of this elite group, this circle, and he learns that they don't like him, they excluded him from the rituals, and they're bringing Richard in to everything. You know, there's some degree of reasonableness to his dislike of them by that point. But of course, by cruelly never giving Bunny a single moment to tell his side of the story, Tartt makes it very difficult to empathize with him. Richard never talks to Bunny, and so we never get another side of the story. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've read The Secret History. What do you think about it? What do you think of the characters? Do you think that I'm right in saying that Henry is a manipulator, that Richard is very unreliable, and that maybe we should be a little bit more sympathetic towards Bunny? Let me know what you think about dark academia and that whole trend, and what you think Tartt is trying to say, if anything, about it. And of course, anything else that you want to ask in the comments as well. I look forward to reading them. Take care, everyone. Ta-ra!